I think it's about time. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm deeply honored that you wanted to come and join us for the conference. And now? No,
Stepped off.
it doesn't work. Maybe now. Yes? Can I?
Yes, it's better.
Can I be heard?
A little better. Yes.
Yes? Okay. Thank you. So, so once again, I just wanted to say that I'm deeply honored that you wanted to find some time and that you made to it. This is really an honor for us. My name is Maciej Kokoszko, and I'm head of the conference, formal head of the conference, because I've got helpers and people that assist and that they've done the bulk of the job. And these are Zofia Rzeźnicka and Jan Mikołaj Wojski, whom I would like just to say thank you. You know that you appreciate, and I know that everyone, so every participant of the conference, will also appreciate your contribution to the conference and to its success. I just wanted to introduce first speakers, so the ones with very short addresses to you. This is our rector for international relations, Professor Łukasz Bogucki, director of our Ceranea Center, which is the main organizer, and this is Ivan Petrov. And since we are on the premises of our Institute of History, let me introduce Professor Dariusz Jeziorny, who is the director of the Institute of History, and who was kind enough to allow us to be here at this very moment. Thank you so much. I just wanted to mention that this is the 6th edition of the conference. The conference is called Colloquia Ceranea because we'll be speaking and discussing. Ceranea, just to commemorate a person who's no longer with us. And this is Professor Waldemar Ceran, who was for a very, 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 very long time our mentor, and for whom we established Ceraneum Center, and we also publish other series, like for instance, source series, Studia Ceranea, and our periodical. So this is just to commemorate him and just remember him, but he would be happy just to address you and say hello. And this is not about monuments and about our contribution and our work on the things that interest us. So I just wanted to say that I'm very happy, and once again, wish you a very, very, very pleasant stay. If you've got any problems, any complaints, please address me, Zosia, Jan, and we try to fix it. And now let me give the mic to Rector for a short address to the conference participants. Professor?
Thank you very much, Professor Kokoszko. Dear guests, professors, participants, welcome to Łódź, if you're here, and even if you're here virtually. It's a great honor and pleasure to be able to open this conference on behalf of the authorities of our university. And Madam Rector herself, who is conspicuous by her absence, but she wishes she were here. She's currently otherwise engaged with her administrative duties. My area here is international relations, so whenever there is an international interdisciplinary conference, it's added value to me that it's a cyclical event. As Professor Kokoszko has just said, it's the 6th colloquium, which already shows a certain tradition and bodes well for the future, because the international contacts have been around for a while and will hopefully continue. I've had a look at the program, which looks very interesting. Also, for a scholar of my profession, I'm a linguist, so a linguist can also find something for him or herself here to enjoy. I would like to extend thanks to the organizers, Professor Kokoszko, Professor Petrov, and everyone else who has just been mentioned for their splendid work. Organizing a conference is always tricky. There's always something that comes up. I hope that it has not been the case and won't be the case here this time. So thank you for your excellent organizational work, and I hope that everyone has a fruitful conference. As I said, the program looks particularly promising. I'm looking forward to the beginning of the keynote lecture, because then I will have to take the French leave to go back to my administrative duties, but at least I'll stay for the beginning to wrap my head around what the topic is going to be about. So once again, thank you. Congratulations for organizing this sixth and hopefully not the last, certainly not the last colloquium of this kind. And welcome to Łódź and welcome to the conference again. Thank you.
And now, Professor Ivan Petrov.
I hope. Yes, no, I think now you hear me. Dear Vice Rector, dear professors, dear colleagues, friends, on behalf of the entire team of the Ceranea Center, on behalf of the Vice Director of our center, Professor Paweł Filipczyk, and myself, it is my pleasure to extend to you a warm welcome to our Ceranea Center, to our university, and to the city of Łódź. It is a great honor for us to host here at the 6th edition of Ceraneum's annual conference so many distinguished researchers from several countries, from many universities, academic centers. Thank you very much for finding the time to participate and for responding to our invitation. I wish all of us a fruitful conference. Thank you.
I'm just fiddling with the mic. And now, Professor Dalby.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dear colleagues, I am really pleased to host you in the Institute of History. I have to say that the Institute is not the co-organizer of the conference. However, many of the Center Ceranea members are the employees of the Department of the Byzantine History, which is a strong center of the Byzantine history research. So it's our pride that we have such colleagues on board. I'm also happy that I can host you in the Institute of History because it's the building in which you can find everything you need, I hope. Outside, I hope you notice that the climate is not very Mediterranean, quite cold today. However, the sunny day could make the impression that we are in the Constantinople, something like that. Tomorrow will be worse, but maybe today is the forecast. But maybe today you will find some moment to visit the city, to see where we live and where is located one of the strongest centers of the Byzantine research in Poland. Thank you very much for coming, and I wish you that you have very nice discussions and you will make new friendships here in Łódź during the 6th edition of the Ceranea of the Colloquia Ceranea. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Professor. So now it's time to begin. You know the program. You have it on the website. Now you get it in the printed form. And you know that we, at the conference, we've got formally 2 keynote speakers. I just mentioned formally because all of you are crème de la crème of the academia. So this is our pride and joy. But let me extend really express my deep gratitude to 2 people. So Professor Andrew Dalby, that he finally made it to Łódź, and to Alesia Guardasole, who will be speaking tomorrow. She will be online, but she is all the time with us, and she's our dear friend. So thank you that you wanted to prepare something very, very special, as always, because this is the rule. And of course, we count on something like comments and discussions after lectures. And now we are, I'm afraid, we are past the time, so we are a bit delayed. However, with a delay of like 8 minutes, we'll be starting the first keynote lecture, and I give the floor and the computer screen to Professor Andrew Dalby. Sir.
First to say that I am very, very glad to be here in Łódź for the first time in my life. And I'm very honored that the Colloquia Ceranea persisted with their invitation long enough for me to respond in the affirmative, which I did, and here I am. My subject is, I'm going ahead now. My subject is classical, not Byzantine. And I was going to apologize for this. But my real point is going to be, how can we reconstruct a past event, a food event, from direct and indirect sources? I hope the question will be of interest, whatever the historical context. And as a consolation to Byzantinists, one or two illustrations are very Byzantine, including the one that you see now. This is from a 15th century Alexander romance from Trebizond, but now at the Hellenic Institute in Venice. Now I'm going to try moving on for the first time. Let's see if we can do that. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Okay. I want to tell you briefly how this exploration of mine began. Glancing from time to time over many years at Alexander's dinners and drinking parties, I found myself rereading the fragmentary sources about the very last day that Alexander was a free agent, able to decide for himself where he went and what he did. Now, there was a round table at Caen in France last summer about ancient Greek food texts, and that was what set me back to work. So, let me remind you, we're on the 17th day of Daisios in the Macedonian calendar, which can be identified with the 31st of May, 323 BC. From the evening of this day, for the next 11 days until Alexander died, we have a written source of a most unusual type for ancient history. The Ephemerides, apparently a daybook of the court in which was noted what the king did each day if it was of public importance. Whether we can trust this fragment, who wrote it, how it came to be published, are all burning questions. The bibliography would run to several pages. But set those questions aside, please, for a moment. Undoubtedly, early writers accepted that the Ephemerides came from the very period of Alexander's last days, even if they were written somewhat a little later. Arrian, Alexander's greatest biographer, faithful companion to every modern historian of Alexander, quotes the daybook, just this once, beginning on the evening of this very day, and continuing to Alexander's death. It's not a verbatim quotation. Arrian never gives a verbatim quotation from any writer. He likes the sound of his own prose too much. But here it is, indirect quotation, accusative and infinitive. The first 5 words are "Pinain paramedio auton comasanta," that after carousing, he drank at Medius's. Now, the task I took on for a paper in Classical Quarterly to be published in December, touch wood, was to find what lies behind those 5 words. How he came to be carousing, what took him to Medius's, who was there, and what happened next. By whom, why, in what context the report of it was published. So let me summarize and at the same time introduce another source, because there is general agreement among several sources. Alexander was carousing, as one did in the late evening, on the way to bed after a dinner. Medius encountered him, by chance apparently, and invited him to a potos, as Greeks usually called a Macedonian drinking party. If it had been Greece and the participants Greeks, it would have been a symposium. There were 20 men there. Now that comes from Nicobule, an almost unknown writer quoted by Athenaeus. Well, it's a convincing number for Macedonia, and is confirmed by the Romance of Alexander, or Pseudo-Callisthenes, as it's often called. That mentions 20 men at the symposium as well. I'm showing you the Nicobule quotation there, which also tells you that there was a lot of drinking. There are various curious details about that drinking party at Medius's added by others. And if you discuss any of the events of Alexander's career, these are the sources to which you will refer. Alexander's cupbearer, Iolas, was there at the drinking party, according to Plutarch's Life of Alexander and others. And that's odd, you know. If Alexander himself was only there because of a chance meeting, why should his cupbearer be there as well? But it could still be true, because, according to the Romance of Alexander, Medius was Iolas's lover. Medius, the host, was the cupbearer's lover. And Arrian had heard this too, one of the many things that Arrian mentioned and didn't care to believe. Also, the famous cup of Heracles was there, according to Diodorus of Sicily and according to the Itinerarium Alexandri. And Plutarch had heard about it, but he didn't believe that. So perhaps this detail was in Clitarchus, who wrote, probably from good information, in the 3rd century BC, and whom Plutarch didn't trust, and whom Arrian never even mentioned. In one way or another, after one adverse reaction or another, Alexander suddenly left this drinking party and went straight to bed, there at Medius's, not in his own quarters in the palace, to which he never afterwards returned. And that's it. 11 days later, Alexander's dead. What I want to explore today is the story immediately before. With whom had Alexander been dining before he set out on that carouse, which should have taken him home to bed, and instead took him to Medius's drinking party? There, from a French manuscript of the Alexander Romance, you see Alexander at dinner, shortly before the last dinner that I'm discussing. What I'll do first is to introduce you, if I may, to the direct written sources. Plutarch, early 2nd century AD. So this is, of course, many centuries after Alexander already. The Life of Alexander by Plutarch. It has Alexander recovering slowly from the loss of his very good friend Hephaestion, eventually returning to sacrifices and drinking parties. On one occasion, he feasted Nearchus's men, and Medius met him on his way to bed. Now, Justin's history of Alexander, part of his general history, is abridged from Pompeius Trogus, who wrote in the 1st century BC. He makes no connection with the death of Hephaestion. There were days of amusement at this period and a revival of the custom of a formal dinner. Alexander was turning the day into a wakeful night, with a komos, with a carouse, I take it, when Medius caught him. I should have moved on there, I think. Plutarch. Okay, there's Justin. And he'll still be there when I move on again. Diodorus of Sicily, 1st century BC. Probably, his narrative is probably based on Clitarchus. He has amusements and a life of festivity. and then sacrifices, after which came Medius's invitation. And then Arrian, 2nd century AD, usually based on good early sources, Ptolemy and Aristobulus, but not here because they left him in the lurch. Arrian is close to Justin and Diodorus. After sacrifices, Alexander celebrated with friends and drank late, wanted to go to bed, but Medius, at that time the most trusted of his companions, met him and invited him to the party. And recensione of the Alexander romance, which is of course a late compilation, sometimes completely fictional and not worth believing, but the episodes surrounding Alexander's death are told from very early sources, it would appear. The Alexander romance tells of Alexander enjoying himself among friends and with the artists of Dionysus. On leaving this celebration, Alexander encountered Medius, whose friends were, he said, the king's closest admirers. And now I come to the itinerary of Alexander, a 4th century text, often overlooked, partly based on Arrian, but partly independent. In this, the army commanders had made a habit of reciprocal invitations to banquets, and then when on one occasion they were banqueting at Medius's, Alexander joined in for the drinking party. I've already given you a fragment of Nicobule, quoted by Athenaeus, but that fragment was about the drinking party with Medius, not the dinner that preceded. Well, here is the only other surviving fragment of Nicobule, quoted by Athenaeus in a different context. She said of a dinner or series of dinners that the performers strove to amuse the king, and that at the last dinner, Alexander himself performed a piece from Euripides. Now, if we want to know what was happening in Babylon around Alexander on this important day, it was important, wasn't it, for the future history of the world, because Alexander was about to die as a result, perhaps, of something that happened on this day. I've now shown you the direct sources, and we ought to be pleased that there are so many sources. Not many single days in the first millennium BC are as well sourced as this is. Even so, we're going to have some difficulty in building a narrative. Let me focus on the elements of the story. And in each case, I'll show you on the screen what sources confirm each detail. You watch me and make sure that I've got it right. How are we doing? Oh, I wanted to move on there. Now, something's moved on and something hasn't. There we are. Right, okay. Yes, got it. Element 1, Alexander set off for bed, accompanied by friends, but eventually moved from one gathering to another. Okay? This might remind us of Alcibiades ending up at Agathon's symposium in Plato's well-known symposium. It's the crucial moment, as far as Alexander is concerned, and who confirms it? The Romance of Alexander, yes, if you take notice of that, supports it. As he left, intending to sleep, Medius approached him, and so on. This doesn't say that he was accompanied, but then Justin said that he was in a group of friends, which means a komos, a carouse. He was already returning from the banquet when Medius invited him and his friends to a carouse that had begun. Diodorus says that too, Plutarch says it too. Without committing himself to it, Arrian confirms that the story was told. He says, there are those that write that Alexander wanted to go to bed, but Medius, at that time the most trusted of his companions, met him. No idea where Arrian gets the idea that Medius was the most trusted of the companions. I think he made it up. By implication, the Ephemerides, the daybook, also supports this. Because in Greek culture in the 4th century BC, a carouse followed a dinner or symposium. And the Ephemerides say, if Arrian converts them accurately to Horatio Obliqua, after carousing, he drank at Medius's. So before carousing, by implication, he was somewhere else. By implication, Nicobule also supports it. She reports in two different fragments, a last dinner and a symposium. Element 2. At his destination, Medius was hosting a drinking party, or in Greek culture, a symposium. This isn't really in doubt, I think. Nicobule and the Romans call it a symposium. The Ephemerides, without giving it a noun, apparently said that Alexander drank there. The infinitive, benign, which perhaps presupposes the noun potos. Several sources call it a komos, Diodorus and Plutarch both call it that, or in Latin, a commissatio, Justin calls it that. Drinks at home were not really a komos in the strict sense, but the word comes naturally enough to a writer telling the story from Alexander's point of view, since a komos took him to Medius's symposium. Element 3, Medius had already been hosting a dinner. This is stated in the Itinerarium Alexandri. You've seen it on the screen. The army commanders had made a habit of reciprocal invitations. It's implied also in the Liber de Morte Alexandri, a late Latin version of some of the early material which is also used in the Romance. And I'll quote it. Medius, celebrating a festival, wanted to bring together his friends. Whatever that occasion may be, that's a little more than a mere drinking party. I would say a preceding dinner at Medius's is also implied in the careless choice of words in Athenaeus' first quotation from Nicobule. Element 4, that dinner was part of a regular series. This is stated in the Itinerarium Alexandri, and only there. I've just quoted it. And we have to decide whether there's a contradiction between this and the statement in the Liber de Morte that Medius, celebrating a festival, wanted to bring together his friends. It need not be a contradiction. He could have insisted on being the host of the dinners on that special occasion because he was celebrating. Element 5, that dinner, no, element 5, Alexander himself was the host of the dinner he had just left. All right, and Nearchus was toasted at that dinner. The only person who tells us that is Plutarch. Element 6, Alexander performed a speech from Euripides at that dinner. Nicobule tells us that. Element 7, Alexander's dinner was part of a series and was accompanied by sacrifices. That comes from Plutarch, Diodorus, Arrian. A series of dinners is implied, I think, vaguely in Justin's phrase, having passed many days in amusements, and confirmed in the following phrase by Justin, intermissum olim convivium solemniter instituit. He reverted to his interrupted habit of a regular banquet, if I've understood that correctly. Tell me if I haven't. Element 8. No, come on, that's it. The artists of Dionysus were present at those dinners and set the tone. This we get largely from Nicobule. During dinner, all the performers strove to amuse the king. And then at the last dinner, one particular incident, Diodorus writes of the festival life. That could take us in the same direction. Now, the text of the Alexander Romance is disturbed at this point, but seems to tell of Alexander enjoying himself among friends and with the artists of Dionysus, of whom many were holidaying in Babylon. Well, in fact, they had wreaked Alexander and competed against one another. We'll hear a little more about that later. In the Armenian Romance, Alexander was enjoying himself with his close friends and the artists of Dionysus, for many had come to Babylon to crown Alexander ceremoniously. And the Armenian Romance of Alexander is a fairly early text, a fairly early recension of the Romance, and worth taking notice of. Element 9, Alexander drank heavily at his own dinner. This is from Nicobule again. Alexander, pledging in unmixed wine, compelled the others to reciprocate, which you'd already seen on the screen. But notice also Aristobulus here, quoted in Oratio Oblique by Plutarch. Aristobulus says that he had a raging fever, became extremely thirsty, drank wine, hence suffered a frenzy, and died 11 days later. This is what we make, this from Aristobulus, I would say, could be called an executive summary of Alexander's last 12 days. He had become extremely thirsty, even on an earlier occasion, so that claim was valid twice at least. The detail that he drank with his, that he dealt with his thirst by drinking wine may likewise be valid for Alexander's dinner, for Medius's drinking party, or very likely for both. He did drink a lot of wine on that day. Lots of people say that. And the same thing is more vaguely said by Justin. Full of happiness, he prolonged the banquet that he was at into a wakeful night before going on to Medius's. Diodorus tells of him having already drunk much unmixed wine. And Arrian said, and drank the nights through, if I can translate him like that, a phrase he had borrowed from Plato and used twice in the same passage. So, having drunk heavily at both gatherings, Alexander fell ill at Medius's and never recovered. Now, I have to go beyond the direct sources, and you need to be critical. Is what I'm doing legitimate? To develop a picture of the last dinner and a context for it, I want to apply what can be learnt from Alexander's earlier dinners, and in addition from imperial dinners in Babylon before Alexander, to try to understand how it was that Alexander in the last months of his life had the custom of celebrating with his friends, while the Macedonian commanders gathered and feasted separately. Not just on the day of his last dinner, but regularly, so it seems. So when did this split occur, if it was a split? When did things begin to go wrong? Think of some of those famous banquets of Alexander and think about when and where things changed and Alexander himself changed. Some ancient authors discuss this very question, the changes in Alexander, in the context of the drinking party at Maracanda, Samarkand. This is autumn 328, 5 years before the period that we've been talking about. You know the story. The sycophants are telling Alexander, who was drunk, that his achievements were greater than those of Castor and Pollux, greater than Hercules, greater eventually than Philip. The Macedonians were ready to argue this out, and Clitus, also drunk, argued that Philip had done better. And anyway, Alexander's achievements were those of the Macedonians. Clitus himself had saved Alexander's life. Alexander was furious. A fight was breaking out, and according to Aristobulus, Ptolemy shepherded Clitus out of the citadel where the drinking party took place to cool off. Clitus went back to taunt Alexander, and Alexander ran him through with a spear. You see a medieval illustration of this moment. Death of Clitus. Conclusion from that, when he dined with the Macedonian noblemen and commanders, he was getting to like it less and less. They behaved as his equals, or more than equals. They argued with him. They laughed at the idea that he was the son of a god. It made him cross. Now, Plutarch's discussion of how Alexander began to alter his own style of dining, his own style of living to that of the country, and tried to reconcile Asiatic and Macedonian customs, is set in the context of Alexander's first marriage. This is in summer 327, roughly a year earlier still, to his marriage to Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian chieftain. And it's a reminder that Persians and Bactrians, unlike Macedonians, made obeisance to Alexander. They kowtowed to him, would be the usual English term. And there were bitter disputes over that. But Quintus Curtius discusses the alteration in Alexander's behavior at an earlier point still, at the moment of the burning of Persepolis, spring 330, 7 years before. With Alexander in the lead, the Macedonians burnt down the royal palace, which they had captured a couple of months earlier. Curtius, and he's the only source who does this, Curtius explains the sympathetic context. Alexander's many good qualities were marred by an inexcusable fondness for wine. When his rival Darius was preparing war, Alexander was spending his days at parties. The hetaira Thais, also drunk, persuaded him that the Greeks would thank him for burning down the Persian royal palace, and that's how it all happened. Well, Curtius may or may not be right about the motivations, but the conclusion is that Alexander had already, 7 years earlier now, found it more congenial to dine with lively non-military companions who wouldn't contradict him. To them, he was not only a king, but a generous, indeed an excessively generous host. His mother, in a letter, had warned him about this, according to Plutarch, who quotes the letter. And of course, we have to argue about whether the letter is genuine or not. She said, according to Plutarch, "Find other ways to reward friends and followers. You are turning them all into kings, getting them lots of friends, and losing all of yours." Well, he didn't follow her advice. I agree with all three. I agree with Plutarch, Arrian, and Curtius. The change in Alexander's lifestyle was underway in 327, 328, even as far back as 330, when, by acquiring and burning the palace of Persepolis, he had made himself more than equal to a Persian emperor. Now consider a later event. The 7-day Bacchanalian procession through Carmania in, let's say, January 324. Arrian prefers to think it didn't happen, like the symposium with Thais, but he gives a full description of it nonetheless. Diodorus is quite brief but matter-of-fact about it. In his summary, it is just as surprising as in the longer descriptions. It isn't on the screen, I'll just give you the English from Diodorus. For 7 days, he proceeded with his troops in festive dress as he was returning through Carmania from India, this is. He himself led a Dionysiac comus, feasting and drinking as he travelled. Curtius and Plutarch both describe it fully in similar terms, but not, I think, from the same source. Here's Curtius, which I've had to abridge. Curtius is quite wordy about things, rhetorical, people say. The friends and the royal company went in front, heads wreathed with various kinds of flowers and garlands. The army caroused in wagons decorated as far as individual means allowed. The king and his drinking companions rode in a cart. I seem to understand a separation of the friends, that is, the Macedonian commanders in front, and the king and his drinking companions in a cart in the middle or at the end of the procession. A close imitation of Dionysus, but I could be wrong. Here's Plutarch, also abridged. You'll see if you read the text in full that both give plenty of detail with many minor differences. I'll save time by not reading that all through, but you have the reference there if you want to read it in full. If you ask me, Clitarchus is the main source for Diodorus and Curtius, as often, and maybe Cares is the main source for Plutarch, but don't quote me on that. There are people who've spent all their lives on the sources of the Alexander Vulgate, as they call it, and I'm not one of those people. But here's the more important point. In both descriptions, there's more than a chance resemblance between Alexander and the god Dionysus, who would have returned from his Indian expedition in a similar state had he existed. Now, in these last years, this is according to Ephemides, and with no reference to the Comos in Carmania, in these last years, Alexander often dressed in the guise of other gods and goddesses. Now, notice in this fragment a distinction between at dinners and, in the last sentence that I've quoted, endete synusia, which I might translate with intimate friends or in an intimate group. Or it could be translated in other ways. Please argue. I could say a little more about those contemporary sources, Cares and Ephemides, but again, perhaps to save time, I had better not take too long. And so I'll set that aside, but they're very interesting as contemporary sources for Alexander and his behavior. Very fragmentary, of course. Alexander considered himself more seriously divine after his return from India, where indeed no one known to the Greeks had made conquests if not Dionysus and Alexander. As we approach the mass weddings, the Persian Macedonian weddings, at Susa in spring 324, we see Alexander giving full rein to his enthusiasms. He must already have issued invitations or commands to actors and musicians to come all the way from the Mediterranean, all the way from Greece and Sicily to court. We know the names of 16 of them listed in the context of the mass weddings by Caries. I haven't given you the names, some of which are famous in other contexts, others not, but they're all there. He was at Ecbatana from about October 324. There, says Diodorus, he staged a dramatic festival accompanied by constant drinking parties of his friends, in which Hephaestion got excessively drunk, fell ill, and died. And Plutarch tells a very similar story. He turned his attention to plays and spectacles since 3,000 performers had arrived from Greece. Just imagine 3,000 performers on their way from Greece and Sicily to Persia, to Iran, and ending by spending several months there. About these performers, where are we now? Yes. About these performers, Arrian says Alexander held funeral games in his honor with contests in literature and athletics. And he again confirms in all 3,000 agonistae, competitors, were in the various events. And that would include dramatic festivals. And they say that soon afterwards, they competed again at Alexander's own funeral. So they remained at court, therefore, enjoyed Alexander's hospitality and competed to please him at his symposia until the last. A long and well-paid holiday at Alexander's court, more than a holiday, a sabbatical year, you might call it. There they were, no doubt, or some of them, at the last dinner. So far, I've used Greek literary sources on Alexander's last dinner and on preceding banquets that set a pattern, but he took over an existing empire, and we have good evidence on the arrangements for the king's dinner under the Persian monarchs who preceded Alexander. To keep himself and his expedition well supplied, he needed that infrastructure. He would have starved without it. He, or rather Caries, is maître d'hôtel, worked to the same budget per guest as the kings before him. How do we know that? Because Ephemides says so in a fragment quoted by Athenaeus. Alexander the Great, I'm quoting, every time he dined with his friends, according to Ephemides of Olynthus, spent 100 minas, there being perhaps 60 or 70 friends at dinner. But the Persian king, as Ctesias and Dinon say in their Persica, used to dine in company with 15,000 men, and 400 talents were spent. And Athenaeus then does the calculation, and it comes out to the same per head. We have details of the staff, to some extent, quoted in a letter from Parmenion to Alexander. We have details of the equipment, quoted in the same letter, both via Athenaeus. We have some information about the food even, although I quote Helene Sanchisi-Würdenberg, who worked a great deal on ancient Persian food. Only the discovery of the cooking notes, she said, of one of the Persian royal chefs would permit us to get an idea of what ancient Persian food tasted like. She's right, of course, and we can't give you recipes, but we can list ingredients, thanks to sources both Persian and Aramaic and Greek on the king's dinner. Alexander, the last of the Achaemenids, inherited this enormous activity, which in money terms I've already described. He made fun of it, but did he put it to an end? Certainly not. And if his own symposia and patronage didn't make full use of it, those of the Macedonian commanders, the companions, probably used up the rest. None of the Alexander historians helps here, but from some unknown source, Polyaenus, in his Stratagems, a collection of military anecdotes, tells a story about the palace of Persepolis before it was burnt down. The punchline is an inscription listing foods supplied to the king, which he says was a bronze inscription. And he tells of Alexander making fun of the king's care for his supplies and ordered the inscription to be destroyed. But the main thing is he gives the list. I won't read out the list, again, to save a little time, but you have all the sources there. The routine of the Persian king's dinner, I must just give you this, is described by Heraclides of Cyme, quoted by Athenaeus, and I'll quote some of it to you. It's clear that some would be carried over to Alexander and some would not, and it will be most interesting to work out which details were carried over to Alexander. I quote, "When the Persian kings are dining, all the attendants bathe and wear fine clothing when they serve them. And they spend nearly half the day dealing with the dinner." Yes, I bet they did. It's for 15,000 people. "Some of those who dine with the king eat outside, and anyone who wants to can see them, whereas others eat inside with the king. But even they do not eat in his company. Instead, there are two rooms opposite one another, and the king lunches in one," that's the word used, "and his fellow diners in the other." The word one seems to be Ariston, but they're talking about the same meal. "The king can see them through the curtain that covers the door, but they cannot see him. Occasionally, however, when a festival is going on, they all dine in a single room, as no doubt they did, in Alexander's case, at the mass weddings at Susa. That's the large room. Whenever the king has a drinking party, and he does this often," I'm continuing with the quote, "a dozen fellow drinkers generally join him. After they've dined, the king, all alone by himself and his guests separately, one of the eunuchs summons the men who are going to drink with him. After they come in, they drink in his company. Although not the same wine, they do this sitting on the floor, whereas he lies on a couch with gold feet. And when they are extremely drunk, they leave. The king usually lunches and dines alone." We're going back to his meals rather than his drinking parties now. "But from time to time, his wife and some of his sons eat with him." That's presumably in the room behind the curtain, where he can see the larger gathering outside, but the larger gathering outside cannot see the king and his guests. During dinner, his concubines sing and play the harp, and one of them leads while the others sing in union. Now, how is that description, a generalized description of the later Persian king's dinner, going to combine with the idea of Alexander celebrating with friends rather than with the Macedonian commanders? Are they the ones dining on the other side of the curtain? One has to do some interesting calculations here, but there seems an interesting similarity, at least, to be pointed out. How did they, I'm nearly at the end now, I hope I've not taken too much of your time. Just one or two mentions, how did they drink? Well, we know how Macedonians drank, thanks to Ephemides, again quoted by Athenaeus. Look at this if we have a moment. "The Macedonians never understood how to drink in moderation, but rather drank heavily at the beginning of the feast. Hence they were drunk while the first courses were still being served and could not enjoy their food." This is a very useful anthropological description, although, of course, by a hostile witness. Must be taken very seriously. Describing the dinner that Alexander offered to the leaders of the Mali and Oxydracae in India, Curtius describes the hangings, hints at dark luxuries. This may, after all, be about the aromas, I think, as much as the ornament. And then finally, compare what Ephemides says. Alexander sprinkled, there it is. Alexander sprinkled the very floor with valuable perfumes and scented wine. In his honor, myrrh was burnt. Awe and silence, born of fear, gripped all in his presence. For he was, Ephemides is getting a little bit towards the critical here, for he was ungovernable and murderous, and was thought, indeed, to be melancholic. Note that melancholic, because of course it's a medical diagnosis by a non-medical writer. So, in my first draft for Classical Quarterly on the drinking party with Medius and its consequences, I included a couple of paragraphs on that dinner that preceded it. The anonymous reader for Classical Quarterly thought them more speculative than the rest. How right she is, I thought. But if I'm to say anything about that dinner, it must be speculative. The best thing for Classical Quarterly, and for me, if I wanted to get the paper published, was to delete those two paragraphs. I did it without a qualm, but I didn't discard them. They have expanded just a little to become the talk that you've just heard. Thank you for allowing me to test my firm opinion that we can reconstruct an almost lost event from the past. In building and testing the reconstruction, we continue to learn. To learn, I hope, about the past, and I hope I'll learn from your reactions. Thank you.
So thank you so very much for this very in-depth and very entertaining piece of experience of yours with the publishers as well, and with the readers, which is an experience we also share from time to time. So anyway, hopefully there are some comments and questions to Professor, and this is time take to be posed. Yes? Sir.
I was just wondering, the detail of Alexander drinking wine while fevered, could that be an interpolation to suggest? So the detail that he drank wine in a fevered state, could that be a later interpolation to suggest that this is what was caused his downfall, because it is a direct contradiction of Hippocratic advice to avoid heating substances in a febrile state?
When you say an interpolation,
or a later interpretation.
Sure, I get exactly what you mean. It's quoted from Aristobulus, who was, of course, present on the expedition, but wrote his reminiscences long afterwards. The political, if I call it political, the position of Aristobulus is very interesting indeed. He was a settler in Cassandria after the expedition. When Cassander founded Cassandria, he was apparently a settler there. Cassander, as founder, was heavily against Alexander, and it would appear that Aristobulus only wrote after Cassander was dead. I'm sure I feel somewhat sure that there is a connection between those two facts: the death of Cassander and Aristobulus feeling free to write what he thought about Alexander, because certainly Alexander was Aristobulus's hero. And so it is common, I think, among modern historians of Alexander to think less of Aristobulus than Arrian did. Arrian considered him to be one of his two main and serious sources. And the only advantage, as far as Arrian was concerned, the only advantage that Ptolemy had over Aristobulus was that Ptolemy was a king and therefore almost bound to tell the truth. Yes, well, we may think of that what we wish. Arrian took Aristobulus very seriously, and many other writers did too. Strabo, for example, and others who quoted him on scientific and geographical subjects. So yes, all I would say is that Aristobulus was not a medic any more than Ephemides was a medic. Ephemides said Alexander was said to be melancholic, which of course is a reference to humoral theory. Aristobulus said that he drank when he shouldn't, and it's a reference to medical advice, which I would have supposed by that period Alexander was not inclined to take if anybody advised him. It would have been a dangerous position by that time to be the physician to Alexander, though not as dangerous as being the physician to Hephaestion. Does that answer your question in a way?
It does, actually. Thank you very much.
And the next question.
So thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. And just to follow up Conan's comment, I think it is really very interesting that all these sources, and especially Aristobulus, are quoting medical things or medical advices, but not quite as they should be, like this kind with a fever. And then the other thing is that a lot of sources are quoting they drank unmixed wine, and this is not common because it always was mixed for being better to digest. And the other thing is the combination of melancholic and a murderous person. This is never fitting in the medical text as so far as I know them, because medical melancholic is kind of depressed, but never as murderous. So this is very interesting, I think, and this might be contain some clues for what happened during this dinner. Thank you.
I'm very happy that you seem to agree with me that we have here a couple of authors who are not medical experts using medical language, and of course it's a thing that can happen with modern historians and in modern history and in even reports of current events, that writers can imagine a diagnosis for some mishap.
For some purpose.
It might, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
A special purpose.
Yes, quite true. Quite true. So yes, in absolute detail, Aristobulus said something like that Alexander had a raging fever, became extremely thirsty, and in fact Aristobulus has two anecdotes, one after the other, in both of which are motivated by Alexander's sudden extreme thirst. Had a raging fever, became extremely thirsty, drank wine. He doesn't say it was wrong to drink wine, but I think everybody who knew anything about humoral theory would be very doubtful about drinking a lot of wine when one has a raging fever.
And unmixed wine.
Yes, oh, quite. The point about unmixed wine, to some extent, makes a distinction or points to a distinction between Greeks and Macedonians. It was always said, at least by Greeks, that Macedonians tended to drink unmixed wine, and a lot of it.
So thank you for the comment. Any other? Professor? Professor Adam Łukaszewicz.
Thank you for this extremely interesting lecture. And only reluctantly I would touch the eternal question of poison. My real interest in this story is the Temple of Serapis in Babylon. This is really puzzling, and I wonder what you think of it.
So you prefer me to begin on Serapis or to begin on the poison question?
Please start with poison.
Yes. Yes, well, I'll certainly do that. I wouldn't consider myself able to see through the great complexity of the Serapis question, whether there was a temple of Serapis in Babylon in 323 BC and what exactly that meant. I prefer not to touch on that, but I know it's a big problem. As for the poison question, well, it is difficult. The greatest expert on Alexander in some ways in our lifetime, Brian Bosworth, began at one point, quite a while ago now, 1971, I think, with an article that really came to the eventual conclusion that probably Alexander was poisoned. And then by 1988 and afterwards, when he was writing his biography and his commentary on Arrian, though that never got quite this far, by the time he was writing that, he was rowing backwards, I think, on the question of whether Alexander was really poisoned. All I said in my article that isn't yet out, I'm still touching wood, hoping that it will be published in December, all I said on this, because I didn't make it part of my subject, was that if, well, two things. First of all, the list of 20 men given by the Romance of Alexander, 20 men of whom 14 were supposed to know all about the poisoning in advance. That seems to me extremely suspicious, because if you were going to do something like that, you wouldn't particularly want to tell 14 men about it in advance. You could be almost certain that one of them would attempt to capitalize on this knowledge before it happened by giving the game away. That's one point. It's certainly not conclusive, far from it. And in any case, what credence do we give to the list of 20 men? That's also much to be thought about. But the other point is that if anybody really had planned to kill Alexander, he would surely have made a plan for what happened next. And it doesn't appear to me that anybody did make a plan for what would happen next. It appears to me that the Macedonian domain began to collapse at Alexander's death, and there was nobody who had made all the preparations to take over. Neither of these points are conclusive, but that's what I feel.
Very good point. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I know that John will want to pose a question. John, please feel free.
Ah, yes, I saw that he was there.
Andrew, that was. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can hear you, John.
That was a super presentation. Thank you very much for a very persuasive reconstruction. I just wanted to ask you about one or two details in this, what we might call multicultural context.
Yes.
One of them is, do you have any thoughts on why Alexander chose Andromeda as the play that he would put on at a feast? Is there something in Andromeda, do you think, that appealed to Alexander? And then the other two specific things are more general. Most of the sources talk about sacrifice.
Yes.
And also there's quite a lot of reference to festival.
Yes.
And I take it, well, what do these things mean in somebody who is godlike, who thinks he's like a god? Notions of sacrifice and festival might seem to pin things down to a proper ritual practice. Do you think these terms are just used in a general way, or do you think that's part of the sort of orderly infrastructure which Alexander was still following?
Well, now you've given me three questions there, John, and which am I to choose to begin with? On the question of sacrifices, I must admit that it had not occurred to me that if Alexander was a god, he had no need to be sacrificing to gods. That is a very interesting point, and I'm not sure at this moment how that would work out. But on the other hand, it is a fact, both that he often sacrificed and that he was considering more and more that he was a god, or something more even than the son of a god, that he had considered himself to be for quite a few years already. Yes, that's what I want to say about the sacrifice question. It is a fact that he did. Sacrifices are often reported in the few fragments of the Ephemerides that remain. There are sacrifices, not necessarily every day, but very frequently, I think, and other sources too often report sacrifices. Now then, as to the festivals, well, I think it's fairly clear that that the artists and actors and the rest of them had been there from the end of the previous year at least, having been invited in very large number, and many, one doesn't know quite how many, had remained, as I say, on a sort of sabbatical. They were there, and several of the ordinary sources talk about continuous festivity and refer to individual festivals. So there was a lot of this. What was your first question again?
Andromeda.
Andromeda, that's it, you see. Well, it was an important play because, if I'm not mistaken, it was already quoted, according to some sources, on the night of the death of Clitus. I think that was Andromeda as well. So, whether it held some specific importance for Alexander, I can't quite say. Whether he was thinking in a sort of obsessive way about, still about his own mentality and his own responsibility to some extent for the death of Clitus. You couldn't say Clitus was without blame, but you couldn't say anybody was without blame. It was Dionysus's fault. Whether he was thinking back about that and therefore slightly obsessed with the Andromeda, who knows? I don't know enough of the Andromeda to be sure about that. But certainly Euripides was well known at court, had been well known at court, and remained, in terms of his texts, well known at court. That's a beginning of an answer anyway. It's good to see you again, John. At a distance.
And now, Professor Adam Plutarch, this will be the last question, please, because
I'll be short, thank you. I just like your investigation, and I quite agree with you that it's possible to reconstruct this kind of events, since, as you know, working myself on pharmacy, let's call it that way, I do believe that it's possible. I would like to make just a short comment, and not a question, but it might be a question, about the poisoning.
Mm-hmm.
As you might remember, I started my activity on text of toxicology, and I should publish my thesis. So you are lucky that you think that your article will be published by the end of the year. My thesis has been in that state for 40 years. But so, the symptoms that we have about Alexander's death do not correspond to any of the types of symptoms of poisoning in the classical text about poisons and demons. And so I'm skeptical about that, unless we are considering a chronic poisoning, which is something completely different, and which doesn't play with the strategy that you stressed. If there is a poisoning, there is somebody who should have taken advantage of that. And so I do think that the whole image, if you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, don't work too much for the poisoning. So that was just a brief comment, but if you have more information to share with us about that, I would be happy to know about that. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that question. And my examination, so far as a non-toxicologist can examine recent articles about which poison it might have been, haven't convinced me that any of the authors of those recent articles has really proved the point. But it's a very interesting exploration, and I should like to hear more from you about your own views on this. But no, they're not totally convincing, any of them, I feel.
We have to wait for the publication of my thesis.
Will you support the idea that Aristotle sent the poison in an ass's hoof, if I remember rightly?
There is this thesis about the poison of water. I don't remember what lake in Greece, and so somebody who brought a cup up to Persia.
Yes, yes.
That doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make a lot of sense. I agree with that. Although by that time, Aristotle had his reasons probably for being a little suspicious of what Alexander might do to him.
But you normally don't kill your students.
No, you don't. That's very true. I'm glad to have that confirmed by an expert.
So thank you. Maybe the times have changed. So. No, Professor, thank you so much for this, for the lecture. Thank you for the comments and the questions. And my position is just to be thoughtful of the timetable and of course of your needs. And now we will have a very short break. But let's stick to 15 minutes and we'll start with a 10-minute delay. Next part of our conference, which will be chaired and moderated by Professor Andrew Dalby. So thank you. Coffee's ready, everything's ready, and the cheesecake and cake and cakes, so and pastries are prepared by Social and Selma.
And let me small announcements. There are some changes to the program. If you have followed our numerous updates, so we know that papers by Professors Georgi Minchev, Szymon Olszaniec, Janko Christoph are missing. But there is one last-minute change which is not printed. So you will find a paper by Marcin Bym in the next session, but he's missing. And there are papers by Ekaterina Dikova moved from the 11th May to 10th May, and paper by Bojana Radovanowicz moved for earlier session. But these two changes you have printed in the programs. And lunches will be served here, and today's banquet will be upstairs in the room 203. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It's been fascinating. Really. 10 minutes strands of the story.
Not all of the Valentine's schools, but I hope it's acceptable in any case.
Just get some rest.
Yes, coffee will be a good idea.
I know, I'm so sorry, I know it's I just that's fine.
I'm afraid.
Thank you, Professor, and sorry for this. It's a pleasure. Thank you for fixing everything up. I think that was quite amusing at the beginning, but
Yes.
it took 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes.
It went very well. Went very well. There's no change to the session that I'm... No change to that. That's fine. Where will I sit when I am chairing? How is that going to be arranged?
If you wish, you can sit somewhere here or next to this table, so somewhere here. I mean, for the beginning, it would be good so that you could be here.
Okay. I suppose while people are speaking, I could sit somewhere close by so that I can see the presentation.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and after the presentation, we can invite all the speakers here.
Yes. Fine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now, what I want to do is Hi, Federica. Nice to meet you.
Because they were in contact, she's from Bologna, but never met.
Or you can.
latest